interactive virtual reality experiences. And they're kind of not quite games and not quite film. They sort of sit at the fringe. We work in the Unity game engine, but we also try very hard to make our experiences not look like a video game. So we draw our inspiration from outside the industry. On previous projects, we've looked outside traditional digital concept art to define the art style. And I'd like to briefly introduce you to those projects before getting stuck into this current project. So this is Easter Rising, Voice of the Rebels. It's a documentary experience made with BBC Learning that's centered around a recording of one man's memory of the Irish uprising in 1916. To represent this memory world, we explored an impressionistic, painterly style using exploited polygons as brushstrokes that constantly shift and shimmer. So every polygon has like vertex displacement, so it's like constantly shifting. As events progress in this experience and become darker, the style shifts into a bold geometric style called vorticism, and the polygons fragment further, grow larger, sharper, and more violent. Another of our previous projects is The Turning Forest. It's a VR fairy tale made with BBC R&D and features dynamic binaural audio. In this experience, you enter a childhood memory of a magical forest. For this project, we worked with the incredible illustrator James Gilliard, and his work is very graphical and bold and flat. It's kind of inspired by 60s and 70s poster design. And yeah, it was an interesting challenge to translate that, which is so flat, into VR, which is like the best digital representation of 3D space. And yeah, so an important part of our process was pulling out the repeating shapes, patterns, and colors, and considering how we could reconstruct the space with those elements. And this is our current project, which I'm going to talk about today in Workline. It's a biographical experience about a young Torres Strait Islander and her experience as her family was evacuated during the 1942 bombing of Darwin. It's being made for Mobile Gear VR, and we started in April, and our team is we have about 4 to 11 people working locally, and we're also working with Double Wire, a film production company. And for this project, we are looking outside the digital altogether and exploring the physical medium by working with Aboriginal fine artist Vernon Ah Kee. So this is Vernon's work. He creates these incredible meters wide portraits in charcoal, probably about that size. And yeah, charcoal, it's a medium that relies on the friction of the stick connecting with the canvas. By its nature, the medium is kinetic, reactive, and gestural. Part of the artwork is the evidence of the time and energy it took to create. A key feature of Vernon's style is how he creates the impression of volume and detail using the density of line work. Vernon always starts by drawing the eyes, and it appears as though the lines are pulled together to form the face, creating an unshakable gaze. As though it's irrelevant, the rest of the figure fragments away, exposing the lines used to construct. So it's kind of like, yeah, they're all very clean lines. It's not like he, goes around the shape of the eyes and the features. He works in many different styles and mediums, and the other that we've chosen to draw inspiration from is his Unwritten series. These ghostly dark forms are even more revealing in the way the density of the strokes has been used to create volume. it's kind of, it's tricky to see on the projector because so much of it is so subtle, but yeah, it's like these long strokes that cross the entire canvas, and where they intersect builds up to create form. This particular artwork was the starting point for me as I started to consider how we could translate this 2D work into 3D and how it would work spatially in VR. So yeah, it's closer detail. You can see that it's clearly constructed from individual strokes that intersect and build up to create form. So it made sense to approach it by constructing those strokes. Without worrying about technical implementation, I started experimenting with how far we could get by just using polygons. So for these tests, I took like a 3D mask of the face and turned every vertex into a polygon, deleted the rest of the faces, and then just simply like extruded in different directions to get these results. And yeah, it was just like a pretty weird approach, but I'm pretty happy with the results. And I wouldn't have tried that if I wasn't trying to solve that problem. So this is the result of that experiment. So by doing these experiments, we're starting to get an idea of how the work might be constructed in a virtual space and the effects of volume, depth, and perspective. And I imagine that the lines sort of shift and connect like magnetic powder. And yeah, sort of very sleek, kind of sliding into place. And yeah, after adding a little bit of that sort of kinetic animation, it's kind of getting there. But I feel like this has lost the initial elegance of Vernon's piece. And the tone doesn't feel right, especially given his intention of the original work, and also the direction our project was going in terms of narrative at that time. Another consideration, like this constant lens that we have to look through is the hardware, being the Gear VR mobile. So in the past, we've struggled with aliasing in Gear VR. It's like super obvious because it's so low resolution, low pixel density, right in front of your eyes. So aliasing has always been really tricky. And constructing the work in this way exposes that, like it makes it even more obvious, if that makes sense. And yeah, our aim with this project is to reduce those artifacts, those kind of digital artifacts as much as possible, and if possible, remove them altogether. So for this project, we want to include the imperfections and irregularities that are such an integral part of the physical medium of charcoal. So this TV show opening titles are messy and explosive to mimic the debris of war and highlight how dynamic the medium can be. The differences in weight, texture, friction, pressure, and pace, and the resulting dust, density, and fragmentation, all these subtle elements beyond the static final piece. An integral part of our production was an in-person workshop with Vernon to discuss the qualities of the medium and the process and intent of his work. To be honest, being a fine artist, I kind of expected him to be very guarded with his process. But he was actually super generous and like very keen to explain every single little thing, like when he uses his left hand, when he uses his right hand, how he positions the paper. It was really excellent. And even these simple strokes that he's drawing here, which literally take him like a second, just gave us so many answers of how he would, how he might approach our experience as an art piece. So before I even began drawing, we discussed the medium itself, the different kinds of charcoal and how much they can vary even within the same type. And he described moments where he'd find a really good piece, only for it to shatter, and then he'd pick up the next piece and it would feel entirely different. We looked at the way charcoal reflects light and how that could be used as a way to add colour to a purely black and white experience, and how specula could be used to make the line work appear more tangible and present as it reacts to the user's perspective. We also looked at different kinds of paper and canvas and the drastic effect that can have on the charcoal. A softer canvas causes the charcoal to smear, creating a soft, cloudy effect. And a harsher canvas causes the charcoal to create more physical artifacts and break more often. Vernon described a gallery piece he created that addressed Aboriginal lynchings. It was drawn on location on a large linen canvas hung on the wall, and the linen was so coarse that it intentionally broke the charcoal as he drew, and those fragments and dirt were left on the ground around the piece as part of the final work. Even beyond the subject matter, Vernon's artwork is a political statement. He described that iconic crosshatch art style that you saw at the start as slashes in the canvas, as though he's cutting the face into the canvas. Every moment of this workshop was so valuable to us as Vernon exposed how the scenes in our experience could be revealed, the pacing, how much pressure in the lines, all these subtle elements we could include to help it feel authentic. Terrible photos. But later on in development, we received this book from Vernon. And for me, this truly highlights the difference between working with a fine artist compared to a traditional digital concept artist or illustrator. When, in my experience, a traditional concept artist is already considering how their work is going to be translated into 3D or used in the final piece. They're already working within the digital restrictions. Like, I know as a 3D artist, when I make concept art, I'm already thinking about the poly count and the topology and how that's all going to make sense in 3D. But working with a fine artist or illustrator, they aren't held back by those restrictions, and therefore they bring new elements and textures, new qualities to the work, and my favorite part, new problems to solve. Being a fine artist, Vernon doesn't really take direction either, which is interesting. He works when the mood strikes him. And initially for this book, we asked him to send us a series of swatches, just simple sketches demonstrating different strokes and gradients with the intention of that telling us the sort of foundational elements of our work, but of his work, but also to literally use those pieces as textures in our experience. And yeah, to be honest, we just need some cross-hatching. I expected him to pick up a piece of paper, pick up some charcoal and do it in like 5 minutes. But no, that's not how he works. And looking at this book, it's really hard to describe it, but yeah, the intent and the skill and the mastery of his work is like palpable. Like, it's I don't know. Yeah, they didn't come from any old artist with any old piece of charcoal. Like, it's absolutely Vernon's hand that is drawing these lines. And as a 3D artist in games, so much of my work is about mimicking another's art, but how can I mimic something like this? And this book feels so special to look at. And it's like that quality, that sense that you get from it is kind of the essence we wanted to bring into our VR project, which is maybe impossible. So returning to the computer, here I've tried to piece together the minimum elements to create a convincing charcoal stroke. So it's just a photograph of one of Vernon's strokes that tiles, and I've added particle effects. We started to think about how the strokes would be drawn in 3D. Does each stroke have its own volume, or is it a 3D mesh with a 2D texture? Would we make like a pop-up book collage effect with pieces of canvas? Would we draw everything in tilt brush? And also consider the movement. Would it sort of flick between frames like a hand-drawn animation, or are the strokes solid, suspended in the air like a sculpture? And would it be possible for our little team on this little headset to explore generative portraiture that also layers individual strokes? And what about these images reveals their digital nature? Here I started to think about the technical implementation. Should the stroke be a cylinder, a plane, or little fragments that rotate in 3D? Another thing we have to consider though is how it will be viewed in the headset. So these kinds of lines, if they're positioned too close to the user's face, because in real life your eyes would sort of converge, but that's not how VR works. So your eyes kind of just get confused and it's super uncomfortable. You can't even see that. But for me, another key element of this project is the color. Being charcoal on paper, it makes sense for it to be simply black and white. But in the physical world, it's very rare to find pure black and white. So the same piece of paper may appear a cold blue under fluorescent light, but in a different room under warmer lighting, it can appear orange. And if you've ever tried picking out white paint, it's like highly relative to the other colors that are present in the environment. So I wanted to take advantage though that VR fills your entire vision, and there are no other colors to sort of draw that relative comparison. So the experience starts a comforting warm tan color, but as the story grows darker, the colors slowly shift to a sterile blue color. Ideally, like, it maybe sounds a bit silly, but for me, ideally this transition would be so slow and subtle that it would be imperceptible, but register on a kind of unconscious level that influences how the user interprets the tone of the scene. And that, yeah, ideally at the end, if I was to ask someone, what colors did you see, they would still describe it as black and white. And like, that's getting pretty subtle, but it's super interesting to me, and I hope that it works. So here we've started looking at shaders, custom shaders, working closely with our technical artist, Brad Hammond. So the shader samples 3 textures, like low density, medium density, high density. And it also has a Fresnel that references the skybox to create that soft edge. Building for a mobile platform, you kind of have to minimize the use of actual transparency, so that's why it references the skybox rather than just fading to be transparent. And on the right is when we've started to look at ways we can bring these lines, kind of give them a sense of movement and life without resorting to that hand-drawn framing animation style. And furthermore, the custom shader acts as a time saver for our small team, as we don't need unique textures or UVs for each model, and the texture resolution appears correct regardless of the scale or distance. It can also be a lot cheaper in terms of performance, as most objects in the scene can use the one material. And then it's always fun to break it. And here I'm just playing around with basically all the variables in the shader and seeing what kind of results we can get. And I've also started adding in imperfections to the underlying models, so the silhouette is never like digitally perfect. We also are using vertex colors, which I've actually never used before, and it's super exciting how much potential they have. So in our shader, black is kind of like neutral mid-tone, and blue is the darkest parts of the drawing, and red fades the material out to the skybox. So this helps give the impression of a hand-drawn image by mimicking how an artist generally draws. The darkest areas are at the edges and the features, with large flat areas holding the least detail. This also helps give the model weight and more messy, and the more messy and imperfect the vertex colors are applied, the better. One of the biggest questions from the start of this project is how we can translate one of Vernon's 2D portraits and apply it to a 3D model. It almost feels like with any other art style, we could simply project the face from the front and then kind of mimic the art style to fill in any patches around the sides of the face and the nose. But due to the intricate and precise nature of his strokes, that's seems impossible and time-consuming. And yeah, this is my first test of kind of instead pulling out the key features, putting them back onto the model, and then multiplying it with our shader. We also use color channels so that the darkest stroke sits at the bottom, and then we have white highlights that sit at the top. And then this was that first moment where I was like, oh my gosh, maybe we're actually getting somewhere. So it's starting to give the impression that although it is a 2D texture applied to a 3D model, it still kind of looks like 3D lines forming a net of density. As we discovered in our workshop, specular can be used to make the charcoal seem more tangible. As we're creating this experience for Gear VR though, it only has rotational tracking instead of positional, so we sort of swapped that around, so now it tracks with the rotation of your head. So anytime you move, the specular sort of shifts around and reacts to your view. And as we were leaning towards a more sculptural approach with the charcoal, we started to consider how we move from scene to scene. Inspired by these animations by Felix Fair, it made sense that the scene transitions by objects simply drawing in and out, kind of like, rather than an animation, it's more like a theater set, and the set pieces are being brought in and out. And these examples have a sense of gesture that makes them feel like they're being hand-drawn, even though many lines are being drawn at once. Once again, we had to consider the limitations of the hardware, so we can't afford for each stroke to be like its own model and its own object. So the approach we took was to leave every model as the one mesh, but break down its UVs into strokes. So each stroke is laid out horizontally and then kind of sequenced in order. So when it's brought into Unity and the shader is applied, it simply swipes from left to right, revealing the texture. And as I mentioned before, it's not actually transparent, it's just rendering a skybox. As that UV approach is quite blunt, it's very linear, moving from left to right, we wanted to add in feature lines which are animated individually, focus on pace and gesture. So these are just empty nodes animated in Maya, and then they're brought into Unity and a trail renderer is added. And then adding a particle effect to that gives it that sort of kinetic friction feeling. Result. One of the biggest challenges of this project so far has been making sure all of these visual elements tie together to make a cohesive style. Not only does Vernon have a few distinctive styles, but his charcoal work is almost exclusively figurative. There's no examples of how a landscape would be composed and sort of tied together. We also wanted to keep it as minimal as possible. We only need to see the objects that are integral to the narrative, and the rest is a kind of faint impression. So with that approach, at the top there, when we put all the objects into Unity, they kind of just look like random objects placed in Unity, like it's very obvious that's what it is. So in the bottom image, I've sort of drawn back over. It's, yeah, really hard to see, but trying to identify the more physical elements we can add back in to create a sense of depth and tie everything together, giving the impression that it was drawn as part of one composition. So for instance, at the bottom there, you can sort of see this faint canvas texture, which helps to orient the user and give them a sense of depth. We also discovered that we can use distance to determine the style, so close objects are rendered in the crosshatch sort of style, and as it retreats into the distance, it becomes more like abstract broad strokes of charcoal. And another important element is the negative space. Leaving it completely void feels too digital, so we added in imperfections to the color, clouds, paper fibers, and noise in an attempt to create a sense of literal atmosphere. And adding in those physical artifacts we'd identified in the workshop, such as fragments and dust. And this is where it's at today. So just last week, we finished up a vertical slice in VR that introduces our character, the little girl, her father, and their connection with her toy doll. The textures you're seeing here are all still placeholder. They're just the ones that took me 30 seconds to draw. So we'd yet to add in Vernon's actual work. The same with this one. That face is just a rough sketch I did to kind of just have something placeholder. But I think the shader already takes it so far, and it's going to look substantially better once we get work by Vernon to replace it. So even this far into the project, we're still making changes to the shaders and still trying to get it just right, as well as perform well on the phone. And yeah, at this current state, to me, it still looks a bit harsh and scratchy, kind of more like ink pen rather than charcoal at this point. So we want to go back and reduce the contrast and try and bring in that elegance and softness of Vernon's work. We're expecting to finish the project in November. And before then, we'll have another week-long workshop with Vernon, literally sitting beside him and going back over everything and adding those elements. Maybe this kind of subtlety that we're trying to achieve isn't actually possible, especially given the limitations of the hardware, such as the screen resolution and pixel density. That maybe that itself makes it difficult to perceive. And compared to traditional game development, these elements would totally be described as polish and kind of, I feel like, dismissed until the end, and then they're just kind of chucked back on top. But we really want these elements to be the feature, and we want it to be the foundation of the entire piece. It so often takes a preset kind of approach to everything, like a stock standard, like be like, hey, let's make a racing game. All right, we need a car, we need a track, we need a finish line, we need engine sounds, and that's fine. but without taking a more problem-solving approach. The industry risks and is already quite self-referential and homogenous. Firewatch, for example, is an incredibly gorgeous game that's visually inspired by printed graphic design and illustration. And now we're getting games inspired by Firewatch, which is super great, but it's kind of like that original intention is becoming diluted and weak. And it's not just the projects themselves, but the preset roles the people working on the project have. So in VR, and I think it's partly because it's a new medium, we've taken the opportunity to work with all kinds of people from other industries, such as theatre designers, installation designers, authors, fine artists, sound engineers, filmmakers, etc. And I think that's very rare in the games industry, and we're missing out on new interesting problems and new creative approaches to solving them. With our project, a Thin Black Line, we're trying to look as far as possible away from the computer and make sure we can't really escape the digital nature of the medium that we work in, but we can try very hard to sort of draw on those the physical world, and at least inspire the memory of that space. Thank you.